All right, so our next session, this session, we're really grateful to Sustain Our Abilities, who helped us put together this session, recognizing that individuals with disabilities are one of the many vulnerable populations as we think about climate disasters. And so we're grateful to be joined by Carol Myers, who is an occupational therapist who's practiced for 38 years in California and Colorado, and she's the co-founder of Occupational Therapists for Environmental Action. And we're also grateful to be joined by Liz Treston, who is a graduate of Hofstra University. She has degrees in speech therapy and speech pathology. She's a C6 tetraplegic from a diving accident and an expert on resiliency and preparedness. So I will turn it over to the two of you.
So I'm going to begin my part with my introduction to disasters in my community with Superstorm Sandy and me. Thank you again for having me and Carol today. I am part of an organization called Sustain Our Abilities. We primarily focus on the medical aspect. We're an international group with doctors, OTs, and PTs, and persons with disabilities on climate change, environmental justice, and how it impacts the medical field. So I'm going to talk about Sandy again. And Superstorm Sandy, as you may remember, occurred in October of 2012 on the East Coast. And apparently everyone in the world knew about it, but the fine people in the city of Long Beach. This is what we were doing in October. It was beautiful weather. This is my service dog. This is myself. I was surfing, and we were planning on going to an October fair. Nowhere on my calendar did it say disaster, move, get out of your city now. Not only did it not say it on my calendar, it did not say it from my city officials until it was too late. Then it became too late. This is what happens in city of Long Beach, usually prior to Superstorm Sandy. When we have a hurricane alert, we go down to the beach, we fill up sandbags, and we put them by our front doors, thinking that it's going to keep back the Atlantic Ocean. FYI, that doesn't work, but it gives us a false sense of security. On the photo on your left is a to-go bag. We happen to live with the New York City firefighter, so we had a to-go bag. Unfortunately, it didn't have things that I required as a C6 quadriplegic. What you see in the bag primarily contained whatever that child needed to be entertained. That's not what you need in a to-go bag, and Carol will address that later. The huge point I want to make in this is that communication is so important. You need to be able to communicate with your local government, your boots on the ground, as we like to call them, so that you become an active part of the ongoing communication, whether it's with your neighbors, with your family, with your friends. You have to know, whatever area of the country you live in, what disaster is going to impact your community. For me, again, it's hurricane, it's snow, and it's rain. On, again, October, we were really lulled into this sense of nothing's going to happen. I refer to my nephew as the child. He is a grown adult now, but he will still and always remain the child. And the child and the dog went to the beach, as we all do in the city of Long Beach when we have a hurricane, because we like to look at big waves. So we went down, and then it didn't seem to be out of the ordinary for a storm. This was just a little bit of water in our street, and we all went to bed thinking we were going to be fine. This is the day after. This is a storm surge. And you will also learn a lot of new vocabulary if you have ever been in a disaster, but you should learn the big vocabulary and all the acronyms before. Again, storm surge. Let me see if you can see my, can you see the power little point on the screen? I live in the smaller section to the left where most of the water occurred. On the north part of this slide is Reynolds Channel, which is a bay. And on the bottom is the Atlantic Ocean. And about 8 p.m., both of those water bodies smacked themselves in front of my front window with whitecaps. This is after the storm. This is the iconic boardwalk was destroyed. The picture in the middle, most people think that's snow. It's not, it's sand. And again, after a disaster, the first couple of days after everyone comes down, you have the New York Times, every newspaper, everyone's very excited about a disaster, except the people that live there. This is what looks like a water line. And you can see from the water line, this is a house that was across the street. The water went into the home right up to where you see the sand blasted across. And the family was in there. And they scattered to the top. A friend of mine who has cerebral palsy lives in one of these homes. He is only alive because at the time, his daughter and her fiance were home. And they carried him up into the attic. Otherwise, he would have perished. And you can see on the bottom, this is what was left afterwards. As a quadriplegic without heat, most of you are in the medical field and occupational therapists. I don't have to explain to you about my core temperature. I have none. I like to describe it as I am a lizard. And once the water cleared and the sand was taken away, I was able to head up to another county where my mother lives. And I stayed with her. My chair was destroyed. It was in the car. My car was destroyed. So I had to wait for transportation. And that's me under those microwave bean bags. This is me with everything that I own. Again, it's a mess. I had some friends get a Hoyer lift taken up to my mother's apartment, and it was just not feasible for me to live there. I began to get pressure sores in the first couple of instances that eventually, after some friends and family mucked and got my house, I was able to go back to my house, but not right away. But we stayed at a hotel for a long time, but we had to go back and forth. This is my service dog. I'm making friends with the medical tent that took up our facility. Just a side note, should you ever live in a disaster, when the medical and FEMA people come, it becomes federal land. And the shortcut that you used to take across the schoolyard, they will tell you this is now federal land, and you could be shot, just FYI. The government is overwhelmed and we become victims. And I'm not a big fan of victim, that's the correct word. I don't like that word because we are not. We're survivors, we're very strong. We want to ensure that we want to go back home, and we will fight to do everything that we can do to do that. This is a picture of what my city begins to look like. We are raising our homes from the house on the right to the house on the left. And now you can see from this photo, in the upper left is what after the storm, and now my community is, we have mitigated, we have done everything that we can as a community with the federal government, with the state government and our local government to ensure that our houses are raised, we have bulkheads. You can see in the front now we have green dune grass to protect us from any impending storm. And unfortunately now, as many of you may know, rain happens to be what I call rain is the new hurricane. It seems to flood primarily anywhere in the country. You do not have to live on in a coastal community. You can live in Iowa and flood. This is after the flood. I became very vocal about accessibility after the storm. This is where the star is. This is our local bar that fed and gave everyone food because we didn't have anywhere to go. I became, unfortunately, I became very vocal, and they have made a lot of different progress within FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, as well as our local OEM and persons with disabilities during disasters and emergencies, that someone is at the table with a disability. Hopefully, let me see if this will work. That's not a blob. This is down my block in the last rain event that was high tide. But you can see it's not coming over to the street anymore because of the protections that the city has taken. But this is becoming a new normal during our rain events. So as Bob alluded earlier, his techniques about relaxation come in very handy. My community suffers a lot of PTSD. This is my home. This is after it was started to raise. Unfortunately, we had some issues with contractor fraud and other major issues within funding and accessibility, but I am finally home. My home is beautiful, and I'm very grateful for that. Again, here I became beyond vocal because I was not the only one, and people were being targeted after a disaster, and they were primarily impacting people that were vulnerable. And they were looking at me as the vulnerable one, when in fact I became the loudest voice. And here's my favorite quote. Write it down, remember it. And thank you so much for listening. I know that I chat fast. I'm from New York. It just is the way it goes. I'm going to pass it on to Carol, and hopefully at the end you'll have many questions. Carol, do you want to take over, or do you just want to say to me?
Oh, you can.
Okay.
You can do the slides. That's fine. Welcome. My name is Carol Myers, and I am a co-founder of Occupational Therapists for Environmental Action. And many people will look at me with sort of a question mark on their face, wondering why are OTs involved in climate change. And my short answer is, well, climate change is the result of human occupation or human activities. And as occupational therapists, I think we have a very important role to play in mitigating climate change. So I'm going to, let's see, so people with disabilities and chronic health conditions experience inequities in preparing for emergencies caused by extreme climate change. They have support needs that challenge their ability to shelter or evacuate to a safe and accessible place when an emergency arises. Current emergency preparedness plans do not consistently address the unique capabilities and support needs of people with disabilities. Now I'm going to review. Can you go back to, yeah. Here are some really sobering facts about inequities for people with disabilities in disaster preparedness. In 2019, more than 41 million US adults were living with a disability, and people with disabilities are 2 to 4 times more likely to die or sustain a critical injury during a disaster than people without disabilities. Warnings and other important messages are lacking for people with disabilities to plan for extreme weather events. And according to a Pew Research Center survey, Americans with disabilities are less likely than those without disabilities to have a computer or a smartphone. And if we think about rural and tribal lands where internet and cell connection is spotty and sometimes even lacking, this really puts everybody at great risk because they are totally unprepared. And especially for people with disabilities, it's also very difficult for first responders to communicate without internet or smartphones. Okay, next. Housing units occupied by people with disabilities are more likely to be in neighborhoods with higher crime rates and higher risk of extreme weather. So if we think about heat islands, where there aren't trees, there is access to parks, and also extreme cold, where some people have to make a choice between heating or eating. And people with disabilities often become institutionalized during and after a disaster and may not return home. And although the federal government requires that people with disabilities not be placed in long-term care facilities, the requirements are often waived during disasters. And the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid can waive these requirements during a disaster. And many people with disabilities are, they go to a shelter and the shelters are not accessible. And so then they're taken to long-term care facilities. And there's no record of who is sent to these facilities either. And it can also be very difficult for them to return home because their home was destroyed or they don't have access to accessible housing, and they don't have the funds to return to their housing as well. And disasters disasters can disrupt access to essential medical care, durable medical equipment. As Liz said, her manual chair was destroyed. And as an occupational therapist, I can only imagine all of the assistive devices that many people need, and those often get lost. And children with disabilities and their families are at a higher risk of injury or death in emergency situations. So several studies assessing emergency preparedness found that the majority of families with children who have special healthcare needs didn't have a disaster kit, an emergency plan, or awareness of a shelter, and less than 50% had battery backup for prolonged power failure. And with climate change, the mental health burden on children and families will increase, such as PTSD, anxiety, and depression. And many newly disabled clients, they don't think like somebody with a disability. They encounter new mobility barriers and other issues, and they're unsure of resources and assume that technology will always work. Next. So this just sort of confirms all these other sobering statistics that there's so many discrepancies in existing essential services. There is an accessible transportation for people to evacuate. As I alluded earlier, housing is a real issue, and healthcare options are often increase the hardship for people with disabilities to evacuate or even shelter in place safely. Next. And now I'm going to give a brief overview of the Person-Centered Emergency Preparedness Workbook. I really like this approach because it is inclusive and it's user-friendly. And the Person-Centered Preparedness Workbook is used as a process tool and framework for individualized emergency planning for people with disabilities. And after the bushfires in Australia, it was clear that people with disabilities had been excluded from emergency disaster planning. And as a result, this project was led by the Center for Disability Research and Policy at the University of Sydney, in partnership with the Queenslanders and Disability Network and the Community Services Industry Alliance. And most importantly, this tool was co-designed by people with disabilities. Okay, well, unfortunately, this is not what we wanted, but this is the Person-Centered Emergency Preparedness Framework or Capability Wheel, and it includes 8 areas of focus: living situation, social connectedness, transportation, assistive technology, health management, personal support, communication, and assistance animals. This is a strength-based framework enabling people with disabilities the capacity to prepare for themselves. And this is what distinguishes it from other approaches. Emergency preparedness and planning is a process. It's not a one-time event. And preparedness plans need to be revisited because abilities can and do change. Next. So there are 4 steps to increase emergency preparedness. The first one is to identify your strengths and support needs in daily life. So knowing how you manage in every day is the first step in planning for how you will manage in an emergency. And in this step, you first think about your support needs in your day-to-day life, not in an emergency. And this step involves your roles and responsibilities in your daily life, such as work, volunteering, meetings, exercise, medication, medical appointments, social engagements, and other family members' activities. Step 2 is know your level of emergency preparedness and disaster risk. Knowing your level of preparedness is achieved incrementally. It can range from haven't thought about it to reviewed actions and informed others. This step involves knowing the risks in your community and how the risks will affect you. And I was previously living in Colorado, and so planning for disasters in Colorado is different from my new home in Minnesota, where there are less risks to plan for, fortunately. And step 3, this step is plan how you will manage your support needs in an emergency. So this step involves more concrete planning for emergencies, such as sheltering in place for 1 week or longer without access to services that individuals rely on, evacuating to a safe place, where to go, how will I get there, and how will I manage my health and well-being. How to manage if the power is disrupted, and oxygen, a power wheelchair, or augmentative communication devices are essential to sustain life. Cost is also a consideration and it can become a barrier. Setting aside 72 hours or longer worth of supplies can be very expensive. And step 4, finally, is communicate your plan with people in your support network. Through collaboration, address gaps. Discussing, documenting, and sharing your situation, barriers, gaps in preparedness, capabilities, and support needs with people in your support network will ensure that you can manage safely in an emergency. And next, the 2023 National Household Survey on Disaster Preparedness from the FEMA depicts the perceived preparedness for disaster among people with disabilities and people without disabilities. And we can see there really isn't a difference between the two groups. 52% of people with disabilities feel prepared, as well as 52% of people without disabilities. However, a survey of 426 people with disabilities in Texas was not as optimistic. 66% did not have a plan for evacuating or sheltering in place. 70% didn't have an alternate power source, and 77% didn't have a backup for their in-home healthcare provider. In a representative survey of Connecticut coastal residents, the results found that if somebody evacuated for a previous hurricane and had confidence that they made a good decision, they are more likely to plan to evacuate in the future. In contrast, if they did not have the confidence in their past decision, perhaps thinking that they had evacuated unnecessarily, they are less likely to plan to evacuate for a future hurricane. Next. And these are 2 pieces of legislation. The Real Emergency Access for Aging and Disability Inclusion for Disasters and the Disaster Medicaid Relief Act. The READY Act and the DRMA Act, they work together to provide solutions for persons with disabilities and older adults during the ever-increasing number of disasters in the United States. The READY Act will enable persons to maintain their health, safety, and independence before, during, and after disasters, and the DMRA will provide uninterrupted access to Medicaid services when recipients must evacuate across state lines. And if you go, there's a link on the references and resources, and you can go to that website, and there is a place where you can sign to support this legislation. So in conclusion, people with disability often navigate everyday in inaccessible environments. They develop individual strategies for optimizing their strengths, managing their support needs, and adapting to changing situations. And these are the strengths that people with disability bring to emergency preparedness. So when service providers are assisting or facilitating conversations about emergency preparedness, it's really important to recognize and acknowledge that people with disabilities have an amazing ability and capability to plan for themselves. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Carol and Liz. Anybody have any questions? there any questions from our virtual audience?
I just want to, just if I could just emphasize a couple of points as you're working with your clients or your family, that Carol really did point out that you must, and it's not just, oh, I'll get around to it. When it's, we call them blue sky moments, when it's clear skies, when you're getting together with your family, that you actually make a plan to get together. Where are you going to go? Do you know somebody in the disaster, what we call the disaster zone? Have someone call that's out of the community so that they all know that your family and your friends are safe. It's a very scary place to be. And without having a network, it becomes its own disaster psychologically, besides the physical portion of it as well.
And I just want to add that I grew up in California, so I experienced a lot of earthquakes, and living in Colorado, floods and wildfires. And I can say personally that these are all really terrifying. I never had the need to actually evacuate, but I experienced some very terrifying moments.
I think it has been a long day for folks.
I think it's been a very long day for folks.
We are so grateful to both of you for sharing your expertise and your stories. And we will include the PowerPoint presentations for folks to take a look at all those great resources after the conference. So thank you to you both. And thank you to all of our online participants and those here in the classroom.